This is not a story about clouds of vapor or flavored cartridges. It's not about USB-shaped devices hidden in high school bathrooms or Silicon Valley entrepreneurs promising innovation. This is a story about something far older and far more human. It's about the patterns we repeat, the mistakes we refuse to learn from, the way every generation convinces itself it has found the safer alternative, the technological solution, the answer to the addiction that came before. This is the story of how harm reduction became a new harm, how a device invented to save lives became, in the span of just 15 years, the cause of a youth epidemic and a public health crisis that would kill dozens and addict millions who had never smoked a cigarette in their lives. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. If you found value in this video, if you believe these stories matter, take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And down in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single comment. This work exists because of you, and I'm grateful you're here. Now, phone away, distractions silenced. Settle in. Because we need to talk about vaping. But more than that, we need to talk about ourselves, about the story we tell ourselves every time we find a new way to deliver an old addiction. Heroin was once marketed as a safer alternative to morphine. Crack cocaine was seen by some users as a cheaper, more controllable form of powder cocaine. Methadone was supposed to end opioid addiction. And in 2003, when a Chinese pharmacist invented the modern e-cigarette, it was hailed as the device that would finally end the cigarette epidemic that had killed hundreds of millions of people across the 20th century. It didn't work out that way. What follows is not a simple morality tale. There are no pure villains here, and no spotless heroes. There is a grieving inventor who watched his father die of lung cancer. There are tobacco companies that saw a lifeline and seized it. There are teenagers who thought they were just trying something harmless, and who woke up months later unable to go an hour without nicotine. There are people who genuinely quit smoking because of vaping, and there are people on ventilators because of it. There are good intentions corrupted, and there are predatory intentions that never pretended to be anything else. This is a modern tragedy, a century of tobacco mistakes compressed into one generation, and the ending is not yet written. To understand how we got here, we have to go back. Not to 2003, when the e-cigarette was invented. Not even to 1964, when the Surgeon General's warning changed everything. We have to go back to the beginning of nicotine itself. To the Americas. To a time before Columbus, before conquest, before the plant became a global commodity that would kill more people than any war in human history. In the beginning, there was tobacco. Nicotiana tabacum. A flowering plant native to South America and Mesoamerica, used by indigenous peoples for at least 8,000 years, possibly longer. Archaeological evidence from Peru suggests tobacco use dating back to 6,000 BCE. This was not recreational. This was not casual. This was sacred. For the Maya, tobacco smoke was believed to carry prayers to the gods. Priests would blow thick clouds of smoke during ceremonies to dispel evil spirits, to communicate with the divine, to mark the boundaries between the human world and the world beyond. In Aztec culture, tobacco was associated with the goddess Cihuacotl, used in healing rituals and as an offering. Among the indigenous peoples of North America, tobacco was smoked in ceremonial pipes during councils, peace negotiations, spiritual ceremonies. It was medicine, it was diplomacy, it was reverence. The use was controlled, ritualized, embedded in structures of meaning that limited consumption and framed it within sacred context. A shaman might smoke during a healing ceremony. A chief might pass the pipe during treaty negotiations. But this was not the chain-smoking addiction that would come later, not the cigarette every hour, not the dependency that would metastasize across the globe. Then came October 1492. Christopher Columbus and his crew landed in what is now the Bahamas, and they witnessed something they had never seen before. Indigenous peoples rolling fried tobacco leaves, lighting them and inhaling the smoke. Drinking smoke, as the Europeans described it, with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. One of Columbus's crew members, a man named Rodrigo de Jerez, became the first European to smoke tobacco. When he returned to Spain and continued the practice, he was arrested by the Spanish Inquisition. His crime, exhaling smoke from his mouth,
a power that could only come from the devil. But the plant had been unleashed. By the early 16th century, Spanish and Portuguese traders were bringing tobacco seeds
back to Europe. At first, it remained a curiosity, a novelty, a medicinal herb. Jean Nicot, the French ambassador to Portugal, sent tobacco to the French court in 1560 as a medicine, claiming it could cure headaches and other ailments. The plant's genus, Nicotiana, was later named after him. By the 1600s, tobacco had spread to Africa, Asia, the Ottoman Empire. Wherever European traders went, tobacco followed. But it was still expensive, still largely the province of the wealthy, smoked in pipes or as cigars, still consumed in relatively small quantities by modern standards. The global addiction engine had not yet been built. That would require something else, something that wouldn't arrive for another 2.5 centuries. It would require industrialization, mass production, the cigarette. Within a century, what had been sacred ceremony became global commodity, and with mass production came mass addiction. For most of human history, tobacco consumption was limited by the sheer labor required to produce it. Pipes had to be packed and lit, a process that took time. Cigars were hand-rolled, expensive, slow to smoke. Snuff required preparation. These methods naturally restricted consumption. A person could only smoke so much in a day before the inconvenience, the cost, or the harshness of the smoke became prohibitive. The cigarette changed everything. Cigarettes had existed in crude forms since the 17th century, but they were hand-rolled, often by the smoker themselves or by skilled workers who could produce perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 per day. They were smaller than cigars, cheaper, faster to smoke, more convenient, but still limited by the bottleneck of human hands. Then came 1880, and a man named James Albert Bonsack. Bonsack was a young inventor from Virginia who had been working on a machine to automate cigarette production. On September 4, 1880, he was granted a patent for a device that would transform the tobacco industry and, ultimately, human health on a global scale. The Bonsack machine could produce 120,000 cigarettes per day. What had previously required 40 workers could now be done by one machine operated by one person. James Buchanan Duke, founder of the American Tobacco Company, immediately saw the potential. He secured exclusive rights to the Bonsack machine and began mass-producing cigarettes at a scale never before imagined. Production costs plummeted. Cigarettes became affordable for the working class. Duke pioneered aggressive marketing campaigns, offering free samples, sponsoring sporting events, distributing cigarettes to soldiers. The cigarette was no longer a luxury. It was an industrial product, as common as bread. And then came the wars. World War I, which began in 1914, was the great accelerator of cigarette addiction. Governments on both sides issued cigarettes as part of soldier rations. In the trenches of France and Belgium, surrounded by mud and death and unimaginable horror, soldiers found brief comfort in tobacco. Cigarettes were small, portable, easy to light, quick to smoke between artillery barrages. General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces, famously said, "You ask me what we need to win this war. I answer tobacco as much as bullets." By the war's end in 1918, an entire generation of young men had been introduced to nicotine addiction. They brought the habit home. Cigarettes became associated with masculinity, courage, survival. World War II amplified the pattern. Between 1939 and 1945, cigarette production soared. Tobacco companies sent millions of free cigarettes to soldiers overseas. By the end of the war, it's estimated that 75% of American soldiers smoked. They returned home in 1945 and 1946, millions of them, and they kept smoking. The post-war years were the golden age of cigarettes. Smoking was everywhere. In movies where Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall made it look glamorous, dangerous, romantic. In advertisements where doctors in white coats recommended specific brands. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, one famous ad campaign claimed. In offices, restaurants, airplanes, hospitals. There was no stigma, no warning labels, no understanding of the catastrophic health consequences that were silently accumulating in millions of lungs. By the early 1960s, nearly 45% of American adults smoked cigarettes. Half the population was addicted to a product that was killing them, and most had no idea. The tobacco companies knew. Internal documents would later reveal that they had known since the 1950s. But they said nothing. They funded misleading research. They manufactured doubt. They advertised harder. The industrial machine had created the perfect addiction delivery system. Cheap, portable, socially acceptable, chemically optimized to create dependency. Tobacco contained not just nicotine, but hundreds of additives designed to make the smoke smoother, the nicotine more bioavailable, the addiction more powerful. Millions were hooked, and millions were dying. But in 1964, everything was about to change. Not the addiction, that would persist, but the story we told ourselves about it. January 11th, 1964, a Saturday morning. The timing was deliberate. In Washington, D.C., in the State Department auditorium, U.S. Surgeon General Luther Terry stood before a room full of journalists and made an announcement that would reshape American public health. The report he released that morning was the product of more than 2 years of intensive research, a comprehensive review of over 7,000 scientific articles by a panel of 10 experts. The conclusion was unequivocal, stated in language that left no room for interpretation. Cigarette smoking is a health hazard of sufficient importance in the United States to warrant appropriate remedial action. The report conclusively linked cigarette smoking to lung cancer in men, found a probable link in women, and connected smoking to chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and coronary heart disease. It was careful, methodical, devastating. The Saturday morning release was strategic, designed to minimize the immediate impact on stock markets, which were closed for the weekend, giving investors time to absorb the news before trading resumed Monday. The world had been told, in official terms, what many had long suspected. Cigarettes were killing people, not might be, were. The tobacco industry's response was immediate and would set the template for corporate denial for decades to come. Within hours, the major tobacco companies issued statements questioning the findings, emphasizing uncertainty, calling for more research. The Tobacco Institute, the industry's lobbying arm, released a statement saying, "We believe the public should be guided by one word, moderation, not cessation, not alarm, moderation, as if lung cancer was a matter of temperance rather than chemistry." Behind the scenes, the industry moved quickly to establish what they called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, later renamed the Council for Tobacco Research. The name suggested scientific inquiry. The reality was obfuscation. For the next 3 decades, the tobacco industry would fund research designed not to discover truth, but to manufacture doubt. They hired scientists to produce studies that questioned the cancer link. They paid experts to testify before Congress that the science was inconclusive. They created an entire ecosystem of confusion. But the momentum had shifted. In 1965, the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act was passed, requiring warning labels on cigarette packages. The first labels were timid by modern standards. Caution, cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health. Maybe, but it was a crack in the edifice. In 1967, the Federal Communications Commission ruled that the fairness doctrine applied to cigarette advertising, requiring broadcasters to air anti-smoking messages. For the first time, the public saw counter-arguments on television, ads showing diseased lungs, people dying of emphysema, the human cost of tobacco. On January 2, 1971, at 11:59 p.m., the last cigarette commercial aired on American television. It was a Virginia Slims ad, tagline, "You've come a long way, baby." After midnight, the broadcast ban took effect. Cigarette advertising disappeared from TV and radio. The cultural landscape began to shift, slowly at first, then accelerating. Smoking rates, which had peaked at 42% of adults in 1965, began their long, gradual decline. By 1990, the rate had fallen to 25%. Restaurants began designating non-smoking sections. Airlines banned smoking on flights. The smoker, once ubiquitous and glamorous, began to be seen as something else, a health risk, an inconvenience, an addict. The lawsuits began. Families of the dead sued tobacco companies for wrongful death. The industry fought every case viciously, using their enormous resources to tie up litigation for years, to exhaust plaintiffs, to win through attrition. For decades, they won almost every case. But the tobacco companies knew they were losing the larger war. Smoking rates in the United States and Western Europe were declining. The stigma was growing. The science was becoming undeniable. Internal documents released through whistleblowers and court orders in the 1990s would reveal the full extent of the industry's knowledge and deception. They had known cigarettes caused cancer since the 1950s. They had known nicotine was addictive. They had known, and they had lied. The industry adapted. They expanded aggressively into the global south, Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, where regulations were weaker and populations were less aware of the health risks. They diversified into food and other consumer products. They lobbied to weaken regulations internationally. But they also began searching for something else, a technological salvation, a product that could deliver nicotine without the combustion, without the tar.
Without the undeniable cancer link. A way to keep their customers addicted while sidestepping the health catastrophe that was destroying their reputation and their market share in the developed world. They were desperate, and desperation makes industries dangerous. The tobacco companies knew they were losing the war at home. They expanded aggressively into Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe. But they also began searching for something else, a technological salvation. They would not be the ones to find it. The man who would invent the modern e-cigarette was not a corporate scientist in a tobacco company laboratory. He was not an entrepreneur looking to disrupt an industry. He was a 52-year-old Chinese pharmacist named Han Lik, and he was haunted by death. Beijing, 2001. Han Lik's father had just died of lung cancer. The elder Han had been a heavy smoker for most of his adult life, and the disease had consumed him slowly, painfully. Han Lik watched his father deteriorate, watched the cancer metastasize, watched a strong man reduced to struggling for each breath. And Han Lik himself was a heavy smoker, 2 packs a day. He knew what was coming for him if he didn't quit. He had tried patches, gum, cold turkey. Nothing worked. The addiction was too strong. One night in early 2003, he fell asleep wearing a nicotine patch. The steady, controlled dose of nicotine normally helped him get through the night without waking up craving a cigarette. But this night was different. He had vivid, disturbing dreams, hallucinations really, intense and disorienting. When he woke, he ripped the patch off, his mind racing. And then, somewhere between sleep and waking, the idea came to him. What if you could simulate smoking without combustion? What if you could deliver nicotine in a vapor, inhaled like smoke, satisfying the physical ritual of smoking without the tar, without the carbon monoxide, without the 4,000 toxic chemicals produced by burning tobacco? Han Lik was a trained pharmacist with a background in traditional Chinese medicine. He began experimenting. He knew that nicotine could be dissolved in a liquid solution, typically propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin, substances already used in fog machines, inhalers, food products. The challenge was creating a mist fine enough to be inhaled deeply into the lungs, to cross the alveolar membrane and deliver nicotine into the bloodstream quickly enough to satisfy a smoker's craving. His breakthrough was using a piezoelectric ultrasound element, a device that vibrates at extremely high frequencies, breaking liquid into a fine aerosol mist. He combined this with a heating element as a secondary mechanism. The result was a handheld device that could vaporize a nicotine solution and produce a cloud of vapor that looked and felt like cigarette smoke, but contained no tobacco, no combustion products, no tar. On April 26, 2003, Han Lik filed for a patent. He called his invention Ruyan, a Mandarin word that means resembling smoke. The device was clunky by modern standards, shaped vaguely like a cigarette but larger, with a glowing LED tip that mimicked the ember of a burning cigarette. It contained a rechargeable battery, a cartridge filled with nicotine liquid, and the ultrasonic atomizer. Han Lik's stated motivation was harm reduction. He genuinely believed he had created a tool to help smokers quit, or at least to reduce the catastrophic health consequences of smoking. He had watched his father die. He did not want to die the same way. And he believed that millions of other smokers, trapped by addiction but terrified of cancer, might want an alternative. In 2004, the Ruyan e-cigarette was released for sale in China. It was marketed explicitly as a smoking cessation device, a harm reduction tool for people who could not or would not quit nicotine but wanted to avoid the deadliest consequences of smoking. The response was modest at first. The devices were expensive, the technology unfamiliar, but word spread. By 2006 and 2007, Ruyan began exporting to Europe and the United States. The devices appeared in specialty shops, in online stores, in mall kiosks operated by small entrepreneurs who saw potential in this strange new technology. Early adopters were often middle-aged smokers desperate to quit, people who had tried everything else and failed. The online forums dedicated to vaping in those early years were earnest, almost evangelical, people sharing their success stories, counting the days since their last cigarette, celebrating the return of their sense of taste and smell. Han Lik, in interviews during this period, spoke with genuine passion about his invention. He talked about his father, he talked about public health. He believed, sincerely it seems, that he had created something that could save millions of lives. The science at that early stage seemed to support the basic premise. While vaping was not harmless, nicotine itself carries cardiovascular risks and is highly
Addictive. It eliminated the combustion process, which is responsible for the vast majority of smoking-related deaths. No tar, no carbon monoxide, no carcinogens produced by burning plant matter. It was harm reduction. And harm reduction, in public health terms, is a legitimate strategy. Methadone, heroin addicts, clean needle exchanges, condoms for sex workers. Not perfect solutions, but pragmatic ones, reducing death and disease even when complete abstinence is not achievable. Han Lik's invention reached American shores in 2007. At first, it was a curiosity, strange Chinese gadgets sold in strip mall kiosks and online forums. But someone was paying attention. someone with billions of dollars and a century of addiction expertise. Big Tobacco had been watching, and they saw an opportunity. The early e-cigarettes were primitive by modern standards. Cigalikes, they were called, because they were designed to look and feel like traditional cigarettes. Long, cylindrical, with a glowing tip. They were marketed by small companies, entrepreneurs, independents who genuinely believed in harm reduction. But they lacked distribution networks, manufacturing scale, regulatory expertise, and most importantly, they lacked the institutional knowledge of how to create and maintain nicotine addiction on an industrial scale. The tobacco companies had all of that. In 2012, L'Oreal Tobacco Company, maker of Newport cigarettes, acquired Blue e-cigs for $135 million. It was the first major acquisition of an e-cigarette company by Big Tobacco, and it signaled a seismic shift in the industry. The companies that had spent half a century denying that cigarettes caused cancer, that had suppressed research and manufactured doubt, that had fought every regulation and lawsuit with ruthless efficiency, those companies were now entering the harm reduction business. The irony was almost unbearable. Reynolds American, the company behind Camel and Pall Mall cigarettes, launched VOOS in 2013. British American Tobacco, one of the world's largest tobacco corporations, acquired multiple vaping companies and began developing their own devices. And in 2014, Altria, the parent company of Philip Morris USA, maker of Marlboro, the best-selling cigarette brand in history, began making strategic investments in the e-cigarette market, preparing for a future where combustible cigarettes might no longer be profitable in developed nations. Big Tobacco brought industrial scale. They brought distribution networks that could place products in every gas station, convenience store, and pharmacy in America. They brought lobbying power, legal teams, marketing departments with decades of experience in selling addiction. But they also brought something darker, the institutional DNA of predatory marketing. Their messaging was carefully calibrated. They never admitted that cigarettes were deadly, even as they marketed alternatives. The language was always switching, choosing, alternative, never quitting, never an acknowledgement that the cigarettes they had sold for a century were killing their customers, and they were now offering a slightly less lethal product. The advertisements featured the same aesthetics that had sold cigarettes for generations. Beautiful people, freedom, rebellion, independence. Make the switch, the ad said, showing attractive adults choosing VOOS or Blue as if it were a lifestyle upgrade, not a desperate attempt to avoid lung cancer. And they brought something else, additives. The tobacco industry had spent decades perfecting the chemistry of addiction. Cigarettes contain not just tobacco and nicotine, but hundreds of additives designed to make the smoke smoother, to increase the bioavailability of nicotine, to suppress coughing, to make each cigarette more addictive than the last. They knew from internal research exactly how to manipulate nicotine delivery to create and sustain dependency. Now they applied that knowledge to e-liquids, flavor compounds to make the vapor more palatable, chemical compounds to enhance throat head, formulations designed to maximize nicotine absorption. They were not trying to help people quit nicotine. They were trying to transfer nicotine addiction from one product to another, ensuring that their customers remain customers. The early harm reduction advocates watched with growing unease. This was not what Honlick had envisioned. This was not a public health intervention. This was the cigarette industry's survival strategy. And there was something else happening, something that would not become fully apparent until a few years later. The regulatory environment was chaotic. The FDA did not have clear authority over e-cigarettes until 2016, when new rules were finally implemented. That meant for nearly a decade these products existed in a gray zone, marketed, sold, distributed with minimal oversight. No age verification requirements at many retailers, no restrictions on flavors or advertising, no
standardized safety testing. Into that vacuum, Big Tobacco poured resources. But they were not alone. A new generation of entrepreneurs was watching. And 2 Stanford graduate students, both smokers, both dissatisfied with the clunky cigalikes that Big Tobacco was selling, were about to create something that would make Blue and VOOS look like relics. Something sleek, something powerful, something that would ignite a teen epidemic and make its creators billionaires before they turned 40. But Big Tobacco's clunky cigalikes, devices that looked like cigarettes, were about to be obliterated by something nobody saw coming. 2 Stanford students with a tech startup mentality. Stanford University, California. In the design program, 2 graduate students named Adam Bowen and James Monsees were working on their thesis project. Both were smokers. Both were dissatisfied with smoking. The smell, the stigma, the health risks they knew intellectually, even if they couldn't feel them yet in their 20s. But they were also dissatisfied with the alternatives. Nicotine patches were unsatisfying. Gum was unpleasant. The early e-cigarettes looked like cheap imitations of cigarettes, performed poorly, and carried their own stigma. Their thesis question was provocative. Could you design a better cigarette? Not to help people quit. That's crucial to understand. Their initial vision was not cessation, but improvement. They wanted to make smoking cleaner, more sophisticated, more compatible with modern life. They began experimenting with vaporization technology, looking at how heat could release nicotine from tobacco or tobacco alternatives without combustion. In 2007, they founded a company called Plume. By 2013, they had launched the PAX vaporizer, a sleek, minimalist device designed for vaporizing cannabis. It found a market among cannabis users looking for a discreet, odorless way to consume. The PAX was beautifully designed, engineered like an Apple product. Minimalist, elegant, tech-forward. But Bowen and Monsees had a bigger vision. They wanted to reinvent nicotine delivery entirely. In 2015, they launched Juul. The design was revolutionary. Forget the cigalikes that tried to mimic cigarette aesthetics. Juul looked like a USB flash drive, rectangular, sleek, about 3 inches long and half an inch wide, made of aluminum with clean lines and a magnetic connection system. It came in simple colors, black, silver, slate. It was beautiful in the way that Apple products are beautiful. Form following function, nothing extraneous, everything intentional. The device had 2 components. The main body contained the battery and a microprocessor that regulated temperature. The pod, a small translucent plastic cartridge, snapped magnetically onto the top. Inside the pod was the e-liquid. One pod supposedly contained the nicotine equivalent of a pack of cigarettes, though that claim would later be disputed. But the real innovation was chemical, not aesthetic. Bowen and Monsees had solved a problem that had plagued the e-cigarette industry from the beginning. Nicotine in its freebase form, the form used in most e-liquids at the time, was harsh. High concentrations created a burning sensation in the throat that made it difficult to inhale deeply. Most e-liquids contain 1.5 to 2.4% nicotine by weight. That meant a smoker trying to satisfy a cigarette craving had to take many puffs over several minutes, which defeated the purpose of replicating the quick nicotine hit of a cigarette. Juul's breakthrough was nicotine salts. By combining freebase nicotine with benzoic acid, they created a formulation that allowed for dramatically higher nicotine concentrations, 5% or 50 milligrams per milliliter, while remaining smooth enough to inhale easily. The benzoic acid lowered the pH of the solution, which reduced the harshness of the throat hit. What this meant in practice was that a Juul user could take 2 or 3 deep puffs and receive a nicotine spike comparable to smoking an entire cigarette. It was, from an engineering standpoint, brilliant. From a public health standpoint, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The smoothness was the danger. One of the natural biological barriers to teen smoking initiation has always been the harshness, the coughing, the burning throat, the unpleasant first experience that makes many teenagers decide smoking isn't worth it. Juul eliminated that barrier. A teenager could take their first puff of a mango Juul pod and barely feel anything unpleasant, just a sweet flavor and a subtle buzz. And then, before they understood what was happening, they were addicted. The flavors were the other key. Juul launched with flavors that seemed designed for adult palates, Virginia tobacco, classic menthol, but soon came cool mint, creme brulee, fruit medley, and the most popular of all, mango. These were not cigarette flavors. These were dessert flavors, candy flavors, the flavors of youth.
Marketing told one story. Make the switch, the campaign said. Images of adult smokers in their 30s and 40s looking satisfied and sophisticated, choosing Juul as a modern alternative to cigarettes. The messaging was carefully crafted to position Juul as an adult smoking cessation tool. They hired former big tobacco executives who understood how to navigate regulatory scrutiny. But the design told a different story. The USB drive shape was perfect for concealment. It fit in a closed fist, in a pocket, in a pencil case. Teachers couldn't distinguish it from an actual flash drive. The vapor dissipated quickly and didn't smell like smoke. In fact, mango Juul vapor smelled sweet, almost pleasant. Students began calling bathroom stalls Juul rooms. The verb Juuling entered teenage vocabulary. And the social media marketing, though officially discouraged by the company, exploded organically. Instagram influencers posed with Juuls.
YouTube videos taught teenagers Juul tricks, vapor tricks, how to hide your Juul from parents, how to charge it using a laptop. The hashtag Juul accumulated hundreds of thousands of posts. The company claimed they didn't encourage this, that it was organic user-generated content. Perhaps, but the product was designed for virality. The growth was exponential. In 2017, Juul controlled about 25% of the e-cigarette market. By mid-2018, that number had soared to 75%. The company was valued at $15 billion. Bowen and Monsees became billionaires. Early employees became multimillionaires. And in high schools across America, a generation of teenagers was becoming addicted to nicotine at rates not seen since the 1990s. Students who had never smoked a cigarette, who had grown up with anti-smoking education, who knew intellectually that nicotine was addictive, they were juuling between classes, in bathrooms, in their bedrooms at night. The nicotine salts delivered addiction efficiently and quietly. The numbers would soon become undeniable. But for a brief moment in 2017 and early 2018, Juul was the success story of Silicon Valley meets big tobacco, a tech startup that had disrupted an industry, created a beautiful product, and built a billion-dollar empire in less than 3 years. And then, the schools noticed. It started quietly, a teacher in Vermont confiscating what looked like a USB drive, only to realize it was a vaping device. A principal in Texas finding a dozen students crowded into a bathroom stall, clouds of sweet-smelling vapor billowing out. A parent in Ohio discovering their straight-A student was waking up at 3 a.m. to vape, unable to sleep through the night without nicotine. Isolated incidents, then patterns, then an avalanche. The data, when it finally came, was staggering. The National Youth Tobacco Survey, conducted annually by the CDC and FDA, tracks substance use among middle and high school students. The 2017 survey showed modest e-cigarette use among teenagers. About 11.7% of high school students reported vaping in the past 30 days. Concerning, but not alarming. The number had been relatively stable for several years. Then came 2018. The 2018 survey, released in November of that year, showed that e-cigarette use among high school students had jumped to 20.8%. That's 3.6 million teenagers. In 1 year, the rate had increased by 78%. 78%. It was the largest single-year increase in adolescent substance use ever recorded for any substance in the history of the survey. The CDC used a word they reserve for the most serious public health crises. On December 18, 2018, U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams issued an advisory. The word appeared in bold text, epidemic. E-cigarette use among U.S. youth has reached epidemic proportions, the advisory stated. This was the language of Ebola outbreaks, of opioid overdoses, of HIV in the 1980s, and now of vaping. What had happened? Juul had happened. The 2018 survey found that Juul was by far the most popular device among teen users, dominating the market. The combination of high nicotine content, smooth delivery, concealmentness, and flavor variety had created the perfect youth product, and the viral nature of social media had done the rest. Juuling became a verb. Students made jokes about it, memes about it, YouTube videos about it. There were tutorials, how to sneak your Juul in class, how to ghost a hip so teachers can't see the vapor, Juul tricks for beginners. The visibility normalized it. When 5 kids in your friend group are juuling, when the popular kids are doing it, when it's everywhere and nowhere, invisible in plain sight, it stops feeling like drug use and starts feeling like social participation. Teachers were overwhelmed. They couldn't patrol every bathroom all day. The devices were tiny, silent, odorless. Students were vaping in class, holding the vapor in their lungs until nothing visible came out on the exhale. Schools implemented new policies, banning USB
drives, installing vape detectors in bathrooms, threatening suspension. Some schools were confiscating dozens of devices per week. But the real crisis was the addiction. Nicotine is uniquely neurotoxic to the developing adolescent brain. The human brain continues developing until approximately age 25, with the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and risk assessment, developing last. During adolescence, the brain is more vulnerable to addiction than at any other time in life. Nicotine exposure during this critical window can cause lasting changes to brain chemistry, making individuals more susceptible to addiction to other substances and impairing cognitive development.
The teenagers vaping Juul were dosing themselves with pharmaceutical-grade nicotine at concentrations designed for adult heavy smokers trying to quit, and they were doing it multiple times per day. A single Juul pod contained as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes, and many students were going through a pod a day. Some were going through 2 or 3. The addiction symptoms were severe. Teenagers reported waking up in the middle of the night with cravings so intense they couldn't fall back asleep without vaping. Students described being unable to concentrate in class, feeling irritable and anxious when separated from their device for more than an hour. Some were sneaking out of class, pretending to use the bathroom just to get a few hits. The behavioral patterns were identical to those of adult smokers with decades-long cigarette addictions. Addiction counselors began seeing teenage clients presenting with nicotine dependency. Parents were horrified. Their children had grown up in an era of aggressive anti-smoking education. They had never touched a cigarette. Smoking rates among teenagers had been declining for 2 decades, from 36.4% of high school students in 1997 down to just 8.1% in 2016. It had been one of the great public health victories of the modern era. And now, in the span of 2 years, that progress had been reversed. But with a cruel twist. These teenagers were not smoking. They were vaping. They had been told vaping was safer, less harmful, a modern alternative. They didn't understand they were becoming addicted to the same drug that had hooked their grandparents' generation. The medical community was alarmed, not just by the addiction, but by the unknowns. Combustible cigarettes had been studied for more than half a century. The health consequences were well documented: lung cancer, COPD, heart disease, stroke. But vaping was new. The long-term health effects were unknown. What would happen to lungs exposed to propylene glycol vapor and flavoring chemicals for years, for decades? What cardiovascular damage might accumulate? What about the effects of inhaling metal particles from the heating coils? Nobody knew. But there were warning signs. Small studies were beginning to show concerning patterns, evidence of inflammatory responses in lung tissue, markers of oxidative stress, changes in blood vessel function. None of it definitive, all of it worrying. And the fundamental truth remained: inhaling anything other than air into your lungs is not harmless. The industry marketed vaping as 95% safer than smoking, based on a UK public health estimate. But 95% safer than one of the deadliest consumer products in human history is still not safe. And for people who would never have smoked, for the teenagers who were vaping specifically because they believed it was harmless, the comparison was meaningless. This was not harm reduction. This was harm creation. The cruel mathematics of the situation became clear. Yes, adult smokers who switched completely to vaping were probably reducing their health risks substantially, but millions of teenagers who had never smoked, who never would have smoked, were now addicted to nicotine because of a product marketed as harm reduction. Public health officials faced an impossible dilemma. If they restricted access to vaping products, adult smokers might be unable to quit cigarettes and would continue dying of smoking-related diseases. But if they allowed unrestricted access, teenage addiction rates would continue to climb. The hearings began. Congressional subcommittees summoned Juul executives. Parents testified, describing their children's addictions, their struggles to quit, the money spent on devices and pods. Teachers described the chaos in schools. Medical professionals presented the emerging research on adolescent brain development and nicotine exposure. Juul maintained that they had never marketed to minors, that their product was intended exclusively for adult smokers switcher from cigarettes. They pointed to their warning labels, their age verification systems, their stated corporate mission. But the evidence was everywhere: the mango pods, the USB design, the Instagram campaigns that, whether officially sanctioned or not,
had featured young, attractive people vaping in social settings. The product design itself, concealable, user-friendly, optimized for the exact behaviors that made teen use possible. A school scrambled to respond, and parents demanded answers. Juul tried to control the narrative. But the damage was done, and something far worse was about to happen. First came the apologies, the carefully worded statements, the damage control. In November 2018, as the CDC's epidemic declaration loomed, Juul Labs announced a series of voluntary measures designed to address youth vaping. The company would halt retail sales of most flavored pods: mango, fruit, creme, cucumber. Only mint, menthol, and tobacco flavors would remain in brick-and-mortar stores. Flavored pods could still be purchased online, where age verification was theoretically more robust, but the retail restriction was positioned as a major concession.
The company also announced it would shut down its Facebook and Instagram accounts, eliminating the social media presence that had, intentionally or not, fueled viral teen adoption. They launched a campaign called Make the Switch that explicitly featured older adult smokers trying to reframe the brand identity around its stated original purpose, helping cigarette smokers quit. The problem was that mint remained available, and mint, it turned out, was the flavor that 90% of teen Juul users preferred after the fruit flavors were restricted. The restriction was theater, a gesture designed to placate regulators without actually eliminating the youth market. Then came the ownership change that revealed everything. In December 2018, just weeks after Juul's public relations offensive began, Altria Group, the parent company of Philip Morris USA, maker of Marlboro cigarettes, purchased a 35% stake in Juul Labs for $12.8 billion. $12.8 billion. The valuation made Juul worth $38 billion, more than Ford, more than Delta Airlines, and it put the company firmly in the hands of big tobacco. The irony was complete. Juul had been created ostensibly to help people quit cigarettes. Now it was partially owned by the largest cigarette manufacturer in America. The harm reduction device was owned by the harm creators. The company that had spent decades denying cigarettes caused cancer now owned a third of the companies selling the safer alternative. September 2019 brought another shift. Juul CEO Kevin Burns resigned under pressure. In his place came Casey Crosswhite, a former executive from Altria, a tobacco man. The transformation was complete. Congressional hearings followed. In July 2019, James Monsies, Juul's co-founder, appeared before the House Oversight Subcommittee on Economic and Consumer Policy. He sat at a long table facing a panel of representatives, cameras capturing every moment. His testimony was contrite, carefully prepared. "I'm a father," Monsies said. "I'm devastated by the presence of youth usage of Juul products. It is counter to our mission. We never wanted any non-nicotine user, and certainly nobody underage, to ever use Juul products." Parents of addicted teenagers sat behind him in the gallery. Their expressions told a different story. Because the internal documents, released through lawsuits and investigations, contradicted the public narrative. Early Juul marketing materials from 2015 and 2016 featured young models at launch parties, vibrant colors, aspirational aesthetics. The original advertising campaigns had featured people in their 20s and 30s in social settings, parties, concerts, urban nightlife, not middle-aged smokers at home trying to quit. One particularly damning document showed that Juul had conducted market research and was aware that a significant portion of their customer base was under 25. Company executives had debated how to handle this information. The decision, it appeared, was to continue with messaging that claimed adult-only focus while doing little to meaningfully restrict youth access until the regulatory and public pressure became unbearable. Monsies' apology may have been genuine. It's possible to believe that he never intended to addict millions of teenagers, that he was genuinely shocked by the epidemic his product helped create. Intentions matter less than outcomes, and the outcome was clear. Juul had created the most efficient youth nicotine delivery system in history, marketed it with aesthetics that appealed to younger users, and profited enormously before making token gestures toward restriction. By late 2019, the company was in full retreat, but it was too little too late. Millions were already addicted, and while Juul scrambled to clean up its image, emergency rooms across America began seeing something terrifying. Young people gasping for air, lungs full of oil. Summer 2019, Wisconsin, a 26-year-old man arrived at a hospital emergency room struggling to breathe. He was previously healthy, athletic, no underlying
conditions, but his oxygen saturation was dangerously low. When doctors performed a CT scan of his lungs, they saw something alarming: bilateral ground glass opacities. Both lungs showed a pattern of inflammation and fluid accumulation that looked like chemical pneumonitis, as if his lungs had been burned from the inside. He wasn't the only one. Within days, the same hospital saw 2 more cases, young adults, all previously healthy, all presenting with severe respiratory distress. All of them had been vaping. In Illinois, similar cases appeared, then California, then across the country, a constellation of mysterious lung injuries, all following the same pattern. By late July 2019, clinicians began alerting state health departments. Something was happening, something new and dangerous. On August 1st, 2019, the Wisconsin Department of Health Services issued a public alert about a cluster of severe pulmonary illnesses associated with vaping. The Illinois Department of Public Health followed on August 7th. The patients were showing up at emergency rooms with coughing, chest pain, shortness of breath, fever, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea,
and in the most severe cases, acute respiratory failure requiring mechanical ventilation. On August 23, 2019, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention activated its Emergency Operations Center and launched an investigation. They gave the condition a name, EVALI, e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury. The cases multiplied rapidly. By September, every state in America had reported cases. Young people, some as young as 13, were being admitted to intensive care units. Their lungs were failing. The chest x-rays and CT scans showed patterns doctors had rarely seen outside of chemical exposure or severe viral pneumonia. But tests for infection came back negative. These were not viral or bacterial illnesses. This was toxic injury. The first deaths were reported in late August. A middle-aged man in Illinois, then a teenager in Oregon, then more. The media coverage exploded. Headlines screamed, "Vaping kills," mystery lung disease linked to e-cigarettes, teenagers dying from vaping. The panic was immediate and widespread. Parents confronted their children. Schools sent urgent letters home. Some states moved to ban flavored e-cigarettes entirely, treating this as confirmation that vaping itself was deadly. But the epidemiology was confusing. Most of the patients, though not all, reported using THC vaping products, black market cannabis cartridges purchased from informal dealers or unlicensed dispensaries. Some reported using only nicotine products. Some reported using both. The common thread was vaping, but the specific product or ingredient causing the injury remained elusive. The human stories were devastating. Seema Herman, an 18-year-old from California, collapsed at home in August 2019, unable to breathe. By the time paramedics arrived, her oxygen levels had dropped to dangerous levels. She was placed on life support. Her lungs were so damaged that doctors told her family she would need a double lung transplant to survive. She received the transplant in October 2019, becoming one of the first EVALI patients to undergo the procedure. She was 18 years old. Adam Hergenretter, an 18-year-old from Illinois, nearly died in September 2019 after weeks of vaping THC cartridges. He spent days on a ventilator, his lungs so inflamed that doctors weren't sure he would survive. He did survive, but with permanent lung damage. In interviews afterward, he described feeling invincible before the illness, believing vaping was harmless because everyone was doing it. By October 2019, the CDC had identified more than 1,000 cases across 48 states. The death toll climbed. 10 deaths, then 20, then 30. The victims were overwhelmingly young, median age 24. Many had no underlying health conditions. They had been healthy weeks before, and now they were on ventilators, their families keeping vigil in ICU waiting rooms. The hunt for the culprit intensified. CDC investigators collected hundreds of vaping products from patients, analyzing the contents in laboratories. They found a bewildering array of substances, dozens of different brands, formulations, additives. Some were legitimate commercial products. Many were black market cartridges, cheaply manufactured, filled with who knows what. Then in November 2019, the CDC announced a breakthrough. Laboratory testing had identified a strong link: vitamin E acetate. Vitamin E acetate, chemically known as tocopherol acetate, is a thick, oily substance derived from vitamin E. It's used in skin creams and supplements. It's safe to ingest or apply topically, but it was never meant to be inhaled. When heated and vaporized when drawn deep into the lungs, it behaves very differently. Black market THC cartridge manufacturers had been using vitamin E acetate as a cutting agent, a thickening additive that made their products appear more potent.
And viscous, qualities that consumers associated with high-quality cannabis oil. It was cheap, readily available, and made the product look premium. The manufacturers didn't test what would happen when it was heated and inhaled. They didn't care. When vitamin E acetate is vaporized and inhaled, it can coat the tiny air sacs in the lungs, the alveoli, where oxygen exchange occurs. It creates a lipoid pneumonia, an oil-based inflammation that prevents the lungs from absorbing oxygen efficiently. In severe cases, it triggers a cascade of immune responses, fluid accumulation, and respiratory failure. The CDC found vitamin E acetate in lung fluid samples from 48 of the 51 EVALI patients they tested. It was the smoking gun. By December 2019, the picture had clarified. The vast majority of EVALI cases, approximately 82%, were linked to THC vaping products, specifically block market THC cartridges containing vitamin E acetate. A smaller percentage involved nicotine products, though the exact role of nicotine vaping in those cases remained unclear. It was possible that some patients who claimed to use only nicotine products were reluctant to admit THC use, especially in states where cannabis remained illegal.
The epidemic peaked in September 2019 and began declining sharply after the vitamin E acetate discovery. Public awareness spread. Users avoided black market cartridges. Manufacturers, terrified of legal liability, stopped using the additive. By February 2020, when the CDC published its final preliminary summary, there had been 2,800 hospitalizations and 68 confirmed deaths. The youngest victim was 15, the oldest was 75, the median age was 24. This was preventable, entirely tragically preventable. The deaths were not caused by cannabis itself or by nicotine. They were caused by an additive used in unregulated black market products that existed because cannabis remained federally illegal in the United States, forcing users to buy from informal markets with no safety standards, no testing requirements, no accountability. But the public panic didn't distinguish. To most Americans watching the news, the message was simple: vaping kills. Sales of all e-cigarettes, including legitimate nicotine products, plummeted. The vaping industry, which had been booming, faced an existential crisis. State legislatures rushed to pass emergency bans. The Trump administration announced plans for sweeping federal flavor restrictions. The irony was bitter. The EVALI crisis was caused by prohibition, the lack of regulated cannabis markets, not by vaping technology itself. But the regulatory response targeted legal nicotine vaping products, potentially pushing adult smokers back to combustible cigarettes, which kill 480,000 Americans per year. The teenagers who survived EVALI left hospitals with damaged lungs, with scars that would last their whole lives. Some would never fully recover their lung capacity. They had believed vaping was safe. They had been wrong. And the companies that had marketed these products as harmless alternatives, the dealers who had cut their cartridges with untested chemicals, the regulators who had failed to establish safety standards, none of them would face consequences commensurate with the harms he had caused. By early 2020, the EVALI panic began to subside as the true cause became clear. But the damage was done, to lungs, to lives, and to any remaining trust in vaping's promise. The regulatory response was swift, sweeping, and often chaotic. September 2019, at the height of the EVALI crisis and the teen vaping epidemic, President Donald Trump announced that his administration planned to ban all flavored e-cigarettes nationwide. Standing in the Oval Office alongside Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar and acting FDA Commissioner Ned Sharpless, Trump stated, "We can't allow people to get sick, and we can't have our youth be so affected." The proposed ban would remove all non-tobacco flavors from the market within 30 days. The announcement sent shockwaves through the vaping industry. Stock prices plummeted. Small vape shop owners, many of whom were former smokers who had built businesses around harm reduction, faced potential ruin. Adult vapers who had successfully quit smoking using flavored products wondered where they would turn. But the comprehensive ban never materialized. The vaping industry lobbied aggressively. Trade groups argued that flavors were essential for adult smokers switching from cigarettes. Some public health advocates, despite their concerns about youth use, worried that eliminating all flavored products would drive adult smokers back to combustible cigarettes or push users toward black market products, exactly the problem that had caused EVALI. The Trump administration wavered. The comprehensive ban was quietly shelved. Instead, in January 2020, the FDA announced a more targeted policy. They would ban flavored cartridge-based e-cigarettes, the Juul-style pod
systems, except for tobacco and menthol flavors. The reasoning was clear. These were the products most popular with teenagers: Juul's mango pods, the fruit medleys and mint flavors that had driven the youth epidemic. But the policy contained a loophole large enough to drive a truck through. Disposable vapes, single-use devices that came pre-filled and pre-charged, were not covered by the ban. Neither were the large tank-based vaping systems used by hobbyist vapers. The FDA's justification was that these products were less popular with teenagers and therefore posed less risk. The industry adopted instantly. Within weeks, manufacturers pivoted to disposable vapes. Brands like Puff Bar, which had been a minor player, suddenly dominated the market. Puff Bar devices came in the exact flavors that had just been banned in pod systems: mango, strawberry, blue raz ice, lychee ice. They were colorful, cheap, around $8 to $15, and contained the same high nicotine formulations that Juul had pioneered. The regulations had changed nothing. They had simply shifted the form factor. State and local governments went further. Massachusetts, in September 2019, implemented a 4-month emergency ban on all vaping product sales, becoming the first state to do so. The ban was later partially overturned by courts, but it signaled the level of panic driving policy decisions. San Francisco, in June 2019, became the first major U.S. city to ban the sale of e-cigarettes entirely, a particularly symbolic move given that Juul was headquartered there. New York implemented a statewide ban on flavored e-cigarettes in September 2019, though it too faced legal challenges. Michigan, Rhode Island, and Washington followed with their own restrictions. The patchwork of state and local regulations created a chaotic landscape,
where the same product could be legal in one jurisdiction and banned 30 miles away. Internationally, the response was even more severe. India, a country of 1.3 billion people, banned the production, import, and sale of all e-cigarettes in September 2019. Thailand, which already had strict tobacco laws, maintained its complete prohibition on vaping. Brazil had banned e-cigarettes years earlier. More than 30 countries implemented some form of e-cigarette prohibition, often citing the teen epidemic in the United States as justification. The backlash was fierce and came from an unexpected direction: adult former smokers. In online forums, in testimonials, and angry letters to legislators, thousands of people described how vaping had saved their lives. They had smoked for 20, 30, 40 years. They had tried everything to quit: patches, gum, prescription medications, hypnosis, cold turkey. Nothing worked. Then they tried vaping, and for the first time they were able to stop smoking cigarettes. Their health improved, they could breathe easier, they could taste food again. They had been cigarette-free for years. And now the products that had helped them quit were being banned or restricted. In their place, combustible cigarettes, which killed 480,000 Americans per year, remained legal and widely available. The contradiction was glaring. The deadliest nicotine product in human history was sold in every convenience store, while the potentially less harmful alternative faced prohibition. Public health experts were divided. Some argued that the youth epidemic justified aggressive restrictions, even if it meant adult smokers lost access to harm reduction tools. Others countered that the evidence from countries like the United Kingdom, where public health authorities actively encouraged smokers to switch to vaping and estimated it was 95% less harmful than smoking, suggested that blanket bans would cause more harm than good. Meanwhile, the disposable vape market exploded. By 2021, brands like Elf Bar, Fume, and Hyde dominated sales. They came in even more flavors than Juul had offered, with even higher nicotine concentrations and even more colorful packaging, and teenagers, predictably, began using them. The 2021 National Youth Tobacco Survey showed that while overall teen vaping rates had declined slightly from their 2019 peak, disposable vapes were now the most popular device type among youth users. The regulatory whack-a-mole continued. Ban one product type and the industry innovated around it. The pattern seemed endless. And then COVID-19 arrived, and the world forgot about vaping for a while. But the industry didn't stop. It evolved. By early 2020, the EVALI panic began to subside as the true cause became clear. But the damage was done, to lungs, to lives, and to any remaining trust in vaping's promise. The regulatory response was swift, sweeping, and often chaotic. September 2019, at the height of the EVALI crisis and the teen vaping epidemic, President Donald Trump announced that his administration planned to ban all flavored e-cigarettes nationwide. Standing in the Oval Office alongside Health and Human
Services Secretary Alex Azar and Acting FDA Commissioner Ned Sharpless, Trump stated, "We can't allow people to get sick, and we can't have our youth be so affected." The proposed ban would remove all non-tobacco flavors from the market within 30 days. The announcement sent shockwaves through the vaping industry. Stock prices plummeted. Small vape shop owners, many of whom were former smokers who had built businesses around harm reduction, faced potential ruin. Adult vapers who had successfully quit smoking using flavored products wondered where they would turn. But the comprehensive ban never materialized. The vaping industry lobbied aggressively. Trade groups argued that flavors were essential for adult smokers switching from cigarettes. Some public health advocates, despite their concerns about youth use, worried that eliminating all flavored products would drive adult smokers back to combustible cigarettes or push users toward black market products, exactly the problem that had caused EVALI. The Trump administration wavered. The comprehensive ban was quietly shelved. Instead, in January 2020, the FDA announced a more targeted policy. They would ban flavored cartridge-based e-cigarettes, the Juul-style pod systems, except for tobacco and menthol flavors. The reasoning was clear. These were the products most popular with teenagers: Juul's mango pods, the fruit medleys and mint flavors that had driven the youth epidemic. But the policy contained a loophole large enough to drive a truck through. Disposable vapes, single-use devices that came pre-filled and pre-charged, were not covered by the ban. Neither were the large tank-based vaping systems used by hobbyist vapers. The FDA's justification was that these products were less popular with teenagers and therefore posed less risk. The industry adopted instantly. Within weeks, manufacturers pivoted to disposable vapes. Brands like Puff Bar, which had been a minor player, suddenly dominated the market. Puff Bar devices came in the exact flavors that had just been banned in pod systems: mango, strawberry, blue raz ice, lychee ice. They were colorful, cheap, around $8 to $15, and contained the same high nicotine formulations that Juul had pioneered.
The regulations had changed nothing. They had simply shifted the form factor. State and local governments went further. Massachusetts, in September 2019, implemented a 4-month emergency ban on all vaping product sales, becoming the first state to do so. The ban was later partially overturned by courts, but it signaled the level of panic driving policy decisions. San Francisco, in June 2019, became the first major U.S. city to ban the sale of e-cigarettes entirely, a particularly symbolic move given that Juul was headquartered there. New York implemented a statewide ban on flavored e-cigarettes in September 2019, though it too faced legal challenges. Michigan, Rhode Island, and Washington followed with their own restrictions. The patchwork of state and local regulations created a chaotic landscape where the same product could be legal in one jurisdiction and banned 30 miles away. Internationally, the response was even more severe. India, a country of 1.3 billion people, banned the production, import, and sale of all e-cigarettes in September 2019. Thailand, which already had strict tobacco laws, maintained its complete prohibition on vaping. Brazil had banned e-cigarettes years earlier. More than 30 countries implemented some form of e-cigarette prohibition, often citing the youth epidemic in the United States as justification. The backlash was fierce and came from an unexpected direction: adult former smokers. In online forums, in testimonials, and angry letters to legislators, thousands of people described how vaping had saved their lives. They had smoked for 20, 30, 40 years. They had tried everything to quit: patches, gum, prescription medications, hypnosis, cold turkey. Nothing worked. Then they tried vaping, and for the first time they were able to stop smoking cigarettes. Their health improved. They could breathe easier. They could taste food again. They had been cigarette-free for years, and now the products that had helped them quit were being banned or restricted. In their place, combustible cigarettes, which killed 480,000 Americans per year, remained legal and widely available. The contradiction was glaring. The deadliest nicotine product in human history was sold in every convenience store, while the potentially less harmful alternative faced prohibition. Public health experts were divided. Some argued that the youth epidemic justified aggressive restrictions, even if it meant adult smokers lost access to harm reduction tools. Others countered that the evidence from countries like the United Kingdom, where public health authorities actively encouraged smokers to switch to vaping and estimated it was 95% less harmful than smoking, suggested that blanket bans would cause more
harm than good. Meanwhile, the disposable vape market exploded. By 2021, brands like Elf Bar, Fume, and Hyde dominated sales. They came in even more flavors than Juul had offered, with even higher nicotine concentrations and even more colorful packaging. And teenagers, predictably, began using them. The 2021 National Youth Tobacco Survey showed that while overall teen vaping rates had declined slightly from their 2019 peak, disposable vapes were now the most popular device type among youth users. The regulatory whack-a-mole continued. Ban one product type and the industry innovated around it. The patterns seemed endless. And then COVID-19 arrived, and the world forgot about vaping for a while. But the industry, the disposable vape era had begun, and with it came an environmental catastrophe that nobody had anticipated. In 2020 and 2021, as the world grappled with the pandemic, as schools closed and reopened and closed again, as masks and social distancing became the dominant public health concerns, the vaping industry quietly transformed itself. The cartridge-based systems that had dominated the market, Juul and its imitators, were facing regulatory pressure and declining sales. Flavors were banned, trust was shattered. The companies needed something new. They found it in disposable vapes. Puff Bar had pioneered the category in 2019, but after the FDA flavor restrictions took effect in January 2020, dozens of manufacturers rushed into the space. Elf Bar, which would become the market leader, launched in 2020. Fume, Hyde, HQD, Breeze, Lost Mary, brands proliferated, each offering the same basic product, a small, lightweight, colorful device that came pre-filled with flavored e-liquid, pre-charged, and ready to use out of the package. When the battery died or the liquid ran out, usually after 1,500 to 5,000 puffs, you threw it away and bought another. The appeal was obvious. No maintenance, no refilling, no charging, no learning curve. You bought it, you used it, you discarded it. The pricing was carefully calibrated, typically $8 to $15, to be impulse purchase affordable while still generating enormous profit margins. The flavors were aggressively marketed: blue raz ice, strawberry watermelon, peach mango, lush ice, rainbow candy, names that sounded like frozen drinks at a mall food court. And the designs were deliberately youth-oriented: bright colors, hot pink, electric blue, neon green,
sleek pen-shaped profiles that fit easily in a pocket or purse, packaging that looked like candy or tech accessories, not drug paraphernalia. By 2022, Elf Bar had become the top-selling vaping product in the United States, surpassing Juul. Disposable vapes accounted for 55% of the total e-cigarette market. Teenagers predictably embraced them. The 2022 National Youth Tobacco Survey found that disposable vapes were now the most popular device type among high school and middle school students who vaped. The regulatory restrictions on cartridge-based flavored products had accomplished nothing except shifting consumption to a different product format, one that was worse in almost every way. Because disposables created a new problem: waste. Each disposable vape contains a lithium-ion battery, the same technology used in smartphones and laptops. These batteries are rechargeable by design, capable of hundreds of charge cycles. But in disposable vapes, they're used once and discarded. Each device also contains plastic, metal, circuit boards, and residual e-liquid containing nicotine, which is toxic to aquatic life and classified as hazardous waste. None of this is recycled. There is no infrastructure for recycling vapes. Most users simply throw them in the trash, where they end up in landfills. The lithium batteries can leak heavy metals into soil and groundwater. If incinerated, they can explode or release toxic fumes. When discarded on streets or in parks, they become litter, bright plastic tubes leaking battery acid and nicotine. The scale is staggering. Estimates suggest that in the United States alone, approximately 150 million disposable vapes are discarded every month. Every month. That's 1.8 billion per year, each containing a perfectly functional lithium-ion battery that gets used for perhaps a week before being thrown away. At a time when lithium is a critical material for electric vehicle batteries and renewable energy storage, when we're told every lithium-ion battery should be recycled to reduce environmental impact, the vaping industry is manufacturing billions of single-use lithium batteries designed to be trashed. The environmental advocates who had focused on plastic straws and shopping bags were largely silent on disposable vapes. The public health officials were focused on youth addiction. The regulators were overwhelmed, playing whack-a-mole with product types. And the manufacturers, most of them based in Shenzhen, China, the same city where Han Lik had invented the modern e-cigarette 2 decades
earlier, continued shipping millions of units to the United States every week. The absurdity was complete. Regulations designed to stop youth vaping had driven the industry to create more appealing, more wasteful, more environmentally destructive products. And globally, vaping had become a phenomenon beyond anyone's early projections. By 2021, an estimated 82 million people worldwide were vaping, with the fastest growth rates among people aged 15 to 24, exactly the population that was never supposed to start. Han Lik's harm reduction dream had metastasized into something he likely never imagined: a global industry worth tens of billions of dollars, millions addicted, an environmental crisis, and still no clear answers. So where does this leave us? 20 years after Han Lik's dream of harm reduction, what have we actually accomplished? The answer is uncomfortable, contradictory, and deeply unsatisfying, because vaping is both a public health triumph and a public health disaster, depending on who's using it and why. Let's start with the success story, because it's real and it matters. For adult smokers who switch completely from cigarettes to vaping, the evidence suggests substantial harm reduction. Public Health England, in a comprehensive 2015 review that has been updated multiple times, estimated that vaping is approximately 95% less harmful than smoking combustible cigarettes. The Royal College of Physicians in the United Kingdom reached similar conclusions. These are not tobacco industry front groups. These are respected public health institutions in a country with nationalized healthcare that has every incentive to reduce smoking-related disease. The logic is straightforward. Cigarette smoke contains over 7,000 chemicals, hundreds of which are toxic, and at least 70 of which are known carcinogens. The harm from smoking comes primarily from combustion, burning plant material and inhaling the resulting tar and gases. Vaping eliminates combustion. While e-cigarette aerosol is not harmless, it contains far fewer toxic substances at much lower concentrations than cigarette smoke. In the United Kingdom, where vaping has been embraced as a smoking cessation tool, an estimated 2.2 million adults who previously smoked are now exclusively vaping. Many report significant improvements in respiratory health, cardiovascular function, and quality of life.
For someone who smoked 2 packs a day for 30 years and couldn't quit any other way, switching to vaping may genuinely save their life. These stories are not propaganda. They're real people who would likely be dead or dying of COPD or lung cancer if they'd continued smoking. But here's the other reality. For never smokers, especially youth, vaping is pure harm. The 2023 National Youth Tobacco Survey found that 2.1 million middle and high school students in the United States currently use e-cigarettes. The vast majority of these young people never smoked cigarettes and never would have. They didn't need harm reduction because they weren't engaging in the harmful behavior. Instead, vaping introduced them to nicotine addiction, a lifetime dependency on a substance that increases heart rate and blood pressure, constricts blood vessels, and rewires the developing adolescent brain to be more susceptible to addiction. This is not harm reduction. This is harm creation. The mathematics are brutal. Yes, millions of adult smokers have improved their health by switching to vaping, but millions of teenagers have become addicted to nicotine specifically because of vaping products that were marketed, explicitly or implicitly, as safer, cleaner, more modern. These are people who would have been nicotine-free for life. Now they're dependent. And the long-term health consequences remain unknown. We're only 20 years in the modern vaping era. The first generation of heavy Juul users, teenagers who started in 2016 and 2017, are still in their 20s. We won't know the full cardiovascular and pulmonary impacts for another 30 or 40 years. Early research shows concerning signs: inflammatory markers, changes in blood vessel function, evidence of oxidative stress. But definitive longitudinal studies tracking lifetime health outcomes don't exist yet because not enough time has passed. There are other known risks. Popcorn lung, bronchiolitis obliterans, a serious lung disease, has been linked to diacetyl, a flavoring chemical found in some e-liquids. Formaldehyde and other aldehydes can form when e-liquids are heated to high temperatures. Metal particles from heating coils can be inhaled into lung tissue. And nicotine itself, independent of the delivery method, carries cardiovascular risks: increased blood pressure, arterial stiffness, heightened risk of heart attack and stroke. The claim that vaping is 95% safer comes with asterisks. Safer than cigarettes, yes. Safe in absolute terms, no. And for someone who never would have smoked, the comparison is meaningless.
Then there's the corporate capture problem. Juul, the company that claimed to be about harm reduction, is now 35% owned by Altria, maker of Marlboro cigarettes. Reynolds American, which owns the Newport cigarette brand, also owns Voos, the second largest vaping brand. British American Tobacco owns multiple vaping brands internationally. The harm reduction movement has been co-opted by the companies that created the harm in the first place. Big Tobacco learned nothing, changed nothing. They simply found a new delivery system for the same addictive substance, rebranded it as innovation, and captured a new generation of customers. The marketing may have changed, but the core business model remains identical: get people addicted young, keep them dependent for life. The regulatory situation remains chaotic. The FDA is theoretically required to review all e-cigarette products through a pre-market authorization process, determining which products are appropriate for the protection of public health. As of 2023, the FDA has authorized a handful of tobacco-flavored products and denied millions of applications for flavored products. But enforcement is inconsistent. New products continue flooding the market. The disposable vape brands dominating current sales, many manufactured overseas, operate in a gray zone of uncertain legal status. The fundamental question remains unanswered. How do we create a regulatory framework that allows adult smokers access to potentially life-saving harm reduction tools while preventing youth initiation? The UK model, embrace vaping for adults, strict enforcement on youth sales, no moral panic, seems to work better than the American approach of bans and restrictions that create black markets and drive product innovation toward unregulated formats. But the UK didn't have Juul. They didn't have the teen epidemic at American scale. Their context was different. Perhaps there is no perfect solution. Perhaps this is the nature of harm reduction with addictive substances. You reduce harm for one population while inevitably creating risk for another. Perhaps the best we can do is minimize damage, enforce age restrictions rigorously, and be honest about the trade-offs. On Lick, the inventor, still defends his creation. He says he saved lives. He may be right. He may also have doomed a generation. Both can be true. So what is vaping, really? Strip away the marketing, strip away the panic, strip away the corporate narratives of harm reduction and the regulatory narratives of public health crisis. What remains? A device, a nicotine delivery system,
more efficient than cigarettes in some ways, less harsh on the throat, locking the combustion products that make cigarettes uniquely deadly, but still addictive, still carrying cardiovascular risks, still introducing foreign substances into lungs that evolved over millions of years to breathe air, nothing but air. Not harmless, not demonic, a tool that can help or harm depending entirely on who uses it and why. But this story was never really about the device. It was about patterns we refuse to learn from. It was about how every generation seeks the safer alternative to the previous generation's addiction and discovers new problems hidden inside the solution. It was about how corporations with no interest in public health will seize any technology, any innovation, any genuine harm reduction tool, and optimize it for profit and market penetration, consequences be damned. It was about how in America, we respond to youth drug use not with education and context, but with panic and prohibition, creating the very black markets that kill people. The EVALI deaths were caused by prohibition, the lack of legal, regulated cannabis markets that forced users to buy contaminated cartridges from unlicensed dealers. And our regulatory response to EVALI was more prohibition, more bans, driving the industry toward disposable vapes that are more appealing to youth and more environmentally destructive. We learned nothing. We repeated the same mistakes we've made with every substance, every technology, every moral panic for the past century. And the human cost accumulates. There are teenagers right now, sitting in classrooms or lying in bed, unable to concentrate because they haven't vaped in 2 hours and the craving is overwhelming. There are young adults with damaged lungs from EVALI who will never breathe easily again. There are middle-aged former smokers who quit cigarettes after 30 years because of vaping and are alive today because of it. There are people still dying of smoking-related disease who couldn't access vaping products because of regulations meant to protect youth. All of it is true. All of it is happening simultaneously. The long-term health consequences remain uncertain. The first generation of heavy vapors, those who started with Juul in their teens in 2015 and 2016, are still in their 20s. We won't know the full cardiovascular and pulmonary impacts.
For decades, the studies are underway. The data are accumulating, but we're conducting this experiment in real time on millions of human subjects without their informed consent. Meanwhile, the industry continues. As of 2023, an estimated 2.1 million American youth still vape regularly. Adult vaping rates have stabilized at around 5% of the population. Globally, the number approaches 100 million users. New products are developed, new flavors are marketed, new loopholes are discovered. The regulatory chase continues, always one step behind innovation. The disposable vapes pile up in landfills, leaching lithium and heavy metals into soil. The addiction industry adapts, as it always has, finding new customers to replace the ones who quit or die. Big Tobacco, which nearly destroyed itself with cigarettes, has found new life in e-cigarettes, ensuring another generation of nicotine dependency and profit. And the question remains, what do we do now? Not what should we have done. That's easy in retrospect. What do we do with the world we have, with millions addicted, with uncertain science, with regulatory chaos, with corporate predation, with genuine harm reduction possibilities coexisting alongside genuine youth addiction crises? Do we choose access or restriction? Do we trust adults to make informed decisions, or do we implement paternalistic bans? Do we prioritize saving current smokers or preventing future addicts? These are not rhetorical questions. They demand answers, and the answers will determine how many people live, how many become addicted, how many suffer. The cloud remains. In bathroom stalls and bedrooms, in parking lots and alleyways, sweet-smelling vapor drifts into the air and disappears. Teenagers inhale without knowing what comes next, what their lungs will look like at 50, what their hearts will tolerate, what price their bodies will pay for this convenience, this buzz, this addiction that felt harmless at 16. We carry this history forward. They carry the physical consequences. The experiment continues. The ending is not yet written. It depends on the choices we make now.